Good morning and welcome to a beautiful day and our very special service of remembrance. Whilst we're unable to meet as we usually would to reflect and remember, it's wonderful to see so many of you that have joined us on Zoom and many more that have joined us on YouTube this morning. From the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank everyone that's helped pull together this morning's service, particularly our Explorer Scouts and also Kieran for all the technical wizardry. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this morning. We will remember them.
Hang on, I don't know how to do this.
O God, our Father who has
brought us together as members
of the first Fressingfield Scout
group, help us to do our duty at all times and to be kind and loyal
to each other.
May all that is good and true
prosper amongst us, strengthen us,
defend what is right and bless
our work that it may be
acceptable to you.
Jesus Christ's sake.
Amen.
I will be talking about the history of Remembrance Sunday and the history of the Royal British Legion and how they help and have helped veterans in previous conflicts. What is Remembrance Sunday? Remembrance Sunday is the second Sunday of November that is dedicated to the commemoration of British servicemen and women. There is a 2-minute silence at 11 a.m. and church services, as well as a gathering at the local war memorial for people to pay their respects and remember those who lost their lives in wars and conflicts. Beginnings of Remembrance Sunday. Remembrance Day originated on Armistice Day on the 11th of November 1919. This was requested by the King to have a 2-minute silence at 11 o'clock to remember those who died in the war. But there stopped being the annual commemorations on the 11th of November in 1939, and then it was decided to dedicate a day of reflection on the nearest Sunday rather than the 11th, to remember and reflect on the casualties of both wars. Why were poppies used in remembrance? When we think of remembrance, we also think of poppies, as they are connected with remembrance because they grew rapidly in numbers on the battlefields after the end of the First World War in Belgium and France. The image of the poppies growing on the battlefield was started by the poet and Canadian surgeon John McCrae in the poem In Flanders, and this represented the sacrifice made by soldiers in the war. On the 15th of May 1921, the Royal British Legion was formed, bringing together 4 organisations for ex-soldiers and veterans. These were the National Association of Discharged Sailors and Soldiers, the British National Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Sailors and Soldiers, the Comrades of the Great War, and the Officers' Association. To help veterans and soldiers, they made the Poppy Appeal in 1921 for the Armistice Day that year, and in doing so made £106,000 to help and care for the veterans. What do they do? When soldiers came back from the war, 1.75 million had suffered from some sort of disability, and so the Royal British Legion helped care for the veterans with disabilities and the families who had lost soldiers in the war. Now they have a large network of support for veterans with a phone helpline where they can help with the financial support of returning from war, as well as moving into care homes for older soldiers, and the mental health and helping the mental health of the veterans, such as mental rehabilitation and physical programs to help them recover from war. Thank you for listening to what I have to say on Remembrance.
My great-grandfather, Lance Corporal Albert Ronald Moss, was in the 48th Royal Marine Commandos Regiment in the Second World War. He fought in Africa and received the Africa Star. He was also involved in the landings in Sicily and Italy in 1943, receiving the Italy Star. On the 6th of June 1944, D-Day, he landed on Juno Beach with Canadian regiments. They only had light equipment. He was killed in action, along with many others. He was 25 years old. The results of war meant my grandfather grew up without a father, and his wife, my great-grandmother, had to look after her son on her own, and lost her husband. The Royal British Legion helped her visit his grave in Bayeux, as she was a war widow. Remembrance isn't just about remembering the dead, but noticing and remembering the effects of war that reach much further than guns and bombs. Every year my grandfather has specific remembrance of his father despite having no physical memory of him. My great-granddad, Percy Leatham, also fought in the Second World War. While setting up an anti-tank gun, he was hit with a shell. He then woke up in hospital in England. When he physically recovered, he guarded Italian prisoners of war. Despite his physical recovery, he had post-traumatic stress disorder, or shell shock as it was known in the Second World War. He didn't talk about the war until he was in his 80s. He died at the age of 93 in 2010. We need to remember those who are severely affected mentally, and I thank the charities and kind people who help soldiers with PTSD and realise its significance. One of these charities, the Salvation Army, helped my great-granddad, and many others such as the Royal British Legion and Help for Heroes help other soldiers too.
War veteran homelessness and lack of help. Unfortunately, many soldiers find it difficult to cope with civilian life after a long period of time serving in the army, and there is still very little support for many of these veterans. How many people are suffering? Well, officially 50,000 war veterans are struggling with a mental illness, 10,000 are in prison and 6,000 are homeless. However, the real figures are expected to be much, much higher than this. Why are war veterans ending up on the streets? Well, there are a wide range of reasons why soldiers are homeless or end up in prison. First and foremost of this is PTSD, where soldiers are forced to re-experience memories of chaotic experiences of war, which leads to homelessness when their lives are dominated by these horrific memories. However, there are other reasons, such as a lack of structure in normal life, being unable to reintegrate with society in normal ways, and preferring to look after themselves only, and not taxes and bills that they pay to the government. Which war veterans are affected? Well, most commonly, veterans aged 40 to 50 are affected, but unfortunately it affects many types of veterans regardless of their age, gender, or how long they've served for, and many people have nothing left in their lives after leaving the army, so they choose to live on the streets as they prefer to look after themselves. What can be done to help? There are a wide range of charities and support groups who help war veterans, which is the best way to support them, because unfortunately there's little government or armed forces action to help war veterans after their experiences in war.
ABF, the Soldiers' Charity, is the national charity of the British Army, providing a lifetime of support to soldiers, veterans and their families. They support 70,000 people in around 60 countries each year by awarding grants to families and individuals and supporting around 90 charities and organisations that support the Army. They help provide housing, education and training, as well as support for older veterans. Another charity that helps to support the armed forces community is the Royal British Legion. They began in 1921 and are the country's largest armed forces charity, with 235,000 members and 110,000 volunteers. They provide lifelong support for serving and ex-serving and their families. The red poppy symbol is a national mark of remembrance and hope. Wearing one shows appreciation for the service and sacrifices of our armed forces, veterans and their families, both past and present. Help for Heroes charity provides aids for wounded veterans and their families to recover and get on with their lives. Every day, men and women have to leave their career in the armed forces as a result of physical or psychological wounds. The charity helps them and those still serving to recover and have opportunities.
Many people think that Remembrance is just World War I and World War II. However, since World War II, there have been 36 other wars that Britain has been involved in, leading to over 7,000 deaths in the British Army. This year marks 70 years since the start of the Korean War between South Korea and the UN against North Korea and China. It resulted in more civilian deaths than World War II. Both sides were responsible for thousands of massacres of suspected communists or prisoners of war. It is estimated that 12 to 15% of North Korea's population was killed. Around 60,000 British soldiers fought in the war and over 1,000 of them died. It is not officially over because the South Korean president refused to sign the peace treaty, but borders have been placed. Overall, almost 5 million people died in the conflict. Another war that is overshadowed by the world wars is the Falklands in 1982, where the Argentinian forces invaded the British territory of the Falkland Islands. This conflict killed 258 British soldiers and 907 deaths in total.
Scouting during World Wars. In World War I, many scouts had volunteered to work on farms, particularly around harvest time. It would have been 8 hours straight of manual, hard, difficult labour. And you think that's enough? They also have to be messenger boys, which was very important at the time because there weren't any communications at all, really. Few homes had telephones. And so the only way to get these messages across is by letter, and they had to be delivered by hand. So they had to run to each individual house delivering letters, which could be miles upon end. Another thing they had to do was also to fundraise for ambulances and other equipment needed for the war effort. There are other things as well, like coast watching, but one of the main things for me is railway junctions, telegraphs and telephone cables. To protect them against enemy sabotage and suspected spies, they had to be really brave as they were standing around these telephone cables, knowing that they will be attacked. And these scouts were only 10, 11, 12, 14 years of age. Another thing with scouting in World War I is that these scouts were also had to be first aid trained. It was required. These scouts had to help sick and injured men from armed forces as well as civilians caught up in attacks. Could you think about this? Could you think about being a 10, a 13, maybe a 14, 15-year-old boy having to help someone who is critically injured from an attack? would you be able to cope with it? Even being old and having to cope with something like that is horrific. But being young and trying to cope with that is even worse. So scouting during the Second World War is kind of the same as the First, apart from the numbers and statistics. 53,000 scouts had to be trained to undertake over 170 National War Service jobs. During evacuations as well, older scouts had to look after young groups of children who were often worried about what's going to happen to them, as well as the scout might be also worried as their children themselves. And they had to give comfort to the children as well, and his pressure on these scouts were enormous at this time. You also had to help with air raids, build shelters. You can even hire scouts to build your Anderson shelter or your Morrison shelter. Other things during World War II that they had to carry out were supporting civilian organisations in air raid, service, fire service, ambulance services. Scouts worked in very dangerous conditions as fire watchers, stretcher bearers, and carrying these messages as well to evacuation points. Evacuations of hospitals as well had to be done. For kids who were 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, maybe even 15 years of age. Trying to do this job with so much pressure when they're actually children themselves still, and having to help other people and support other people around them. They also teach the Home Guard. The young children teaching older men in the Home Guard how to protect their country.
Hello, my name is Porrick Neekirk, and I come from a family with a long military history. I'm going to talk to you about some different forms of remembrance and make links to the history of some of my family members. Both of my grandfathers served in the army, and both rose to the rank of colonel. My mother's father had a long and distinguished career with the Sherwood Foresters. My father's father commanded the London Scottish and played a prominent role with the Territorial Army in London. Many other members of my family have served and are currently serving in the armed forces. One of my great-grandfathers served in the First World War in the trenches. My father served with the Royal Yeomanry. One uncle served in the Irish Guards and then went on to be a helicopter pilot in the Army Air Corps, and another served in Northern Ireland with the Gordon Highlanders, and subsequently with the Royal Signals. I have one brother serving in the Royal Navy and another currently at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. Cryche Stand is now the memorial for the Mercian Regiment and is still the focal point for remembrance. They hold an annual pilgrimage and service on the first Sunday in July every year. My family has attended Cryche Sunday on many occasions. The attack on HMS Royal Oak was thought to be extremely unlikely, as the area she was in was protected by heavy anti-submarine nets, and the wrecks of sunken ships from the First World War. The captain of U-47 found a gap in the nets and exploited this opportunity. Sadly, the crew of HMS Royal Oak was largely made up of very young men, most of whom were lost in the attack. After the war, the Rear Admiral Ben, my great-grandfather, met the captain of U-47. Various members of my family have visited this war grave over the years. The local branch of the Royal British Legion have always made them very welcome and have been extremely supportive. Every year, as well as a white ensign being placed on the wreck by divers, a service commemoration is held in a small flotilla of boats above the wreck. Captain Ben's daughter, my grandmother, has attended and laid a wreath on the water. This year, my cousin went to Scapa Flow and visited the war grave by kayak and laid a small wreath on the water. The local guide was very willing to assist her. The local newspaper published a report of this visit. There are many forms of remembrance, and I've chosen a few for this presentation. Two of my brothers were members of the Army Cadet Force, and with their units have visited the Arboretum. The Menin Gate is an astonishing memorial. You don't appreciate the scale of it and the number of names engraved on it until you visit in person. My father and grandmother have visited this memorial and were overawed by the scale of it. The picture here shows HMS Queen Elizabeth during the D-Day commemorations. The words on deck are made from members of the crew and the petals of the poppy are aircraft. My brother was a member of the crew when the commemorative flotilla sailed and appears in the first letter E in the photograph. The last post was played by a bugler from the Sherwood Foresters, now the Mercian Regiment, at my maternal grandfather's funeral. My paternal grandfather had his regimental march played by a piper at his funeral. I was very lucky to visit the blood-swept lands and seas of red at the Tower of London in 2014, and was amazed at the number of poppies in the display. Seeing this gave me some idea of the scale of the sacrifices made. Poetry became a popular medium for expressing grief and remembrance, and there were quite a number of war poets in both world wars.
War and conflict over the years has resulted in many charities and support organisations being created. All of these organisations play an important part in looking after our servicemen and women. My father helps to run a charity which looks after ex-servicemen and women and their families.
I'd just like to say thank you very much to all our families and members of our Scout group and friends that have joined us today. Thank you very much.